Hi everyone, my name is Sunchi. For my final project, I will be looking at football fan networks as complex adaptive systems. That is how interactions between the individual members and past experiences within these groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina affect the emergence of football riots. Now, first to give you a bit of a background, like during the early 1990s, Bosnia experienced a very heavy armed conflict between the three ethnic groups within it, which then resulted in implementing this peace accord in Dayton, Ohio, that resulted in dividing it into two entities, one of them being the Federation and the other one being the Republic of Srpska. And in one of them is now the home of the Bosniaks and Croats, and the other one of the Serbs. And the purpose of this was to reach stability, but what it does, it just increased the ethnic tensions, which are now very prominent in a lot of aspects and result in very violent conflicts. But one of the heaviest ones is during football matches, and a lot of the youth are members of these football fan networks that have very like chauvinistic, patriotic ideals, and engage in most of the violent conflict. In fact, football riots in Bosnia are considered in the world as one of the worst football riots, because like at every game there's very high security measures, especially like between the two opposing clubs in the town. Very often there's very intense riots in which a lot of people are hurt, a lot of youth are detained. Um, so the way I'm connecting this to complexity theories is that these supporters, especially in the context of conflict, they function as a single system, exhibiting a collective behavior both in a positive context, that is, they have a common identity and support for their respective club, and in a negative context, that is, they stereotype against the opposing group and engage in said violent conflict. And as the group is composed of individual agents, and these form into a system based on a set of rules, which exhibits a collective behavior that is patterned but also very unpredictable. We can then observe it as a complex adaptive system. Uh, the way I conducted my research was, even though I'm fairly informed into the background of it and everything, I still was really uninformed in how these fan networks are organized and how they work. I wanted to break some like prejudices I had about it, much like the rest of the general public. And so obviously I used a lot of scholarly articles that focused on fan networks in general, but also the way I got really deep into the whole matter was I contacted some of the fan members from the country and interviewed them. I first focused on the organization of the fan clubs, in that I asked one of the interviewees whether he thinks that all members are equal or have the equal amount of say in what the club does next or the ideologies of it, or whether they just kind of go with it. And he said that even though it's supposed to be decentralized, because they're sort of like they consider themselves sort of like revolutionaries and opposed to the general public. And even though it's like this, there does still exist some sort of hierarchy, and that older members are more respected, and they have more the things that they say are kind of like the things that are most past, because of everything. Like he said that everything that they went through, everything that they did with the club, which brought me to the first thing I related to complex adaptive systems, which is how agents learn through interacting with each other, and the behavior of the system as a whole is then affected. And this is usually done when a behavior is perceived as most beneficial to the survival of the system as a whole. That is, agents perform simple actions that they deem beneficial, and these then translate into larger behaviors. That is, the agents don't deem them beneficial, but the system as a whole perceives this behavior as beneficial, such as when we consider ants, like the most popular example here, is they don't really think about these actions, but the things they do prove to be the most beneficial for the system as a whole. In this case, this would be aggression towards the rival club, and then the emergent behavior, the more unpredictable one, would be the football riots. So I wondered how exactly this particular behavior came to be the most beneficial one. So I asked the other correspondent why he thinks that like even though obviously the two fan networks are rivals, so they can't really be in harmony. Like obviously they have to compete with each other, but why is it that they get into such intense conflict? Why the public perceives them as very aggressive? Why there's high security measures? And then he went into ethnic division a lot more and talked about how before the three ethnicities divided, there was no clear cut national identity, but rather everyone was Yugoslavian, which didn't work for Croats. And this was also the case in football because there was only one club representing it, hence only one fan networks. And it didn't work for the Croatian people because they were deprived of this national identity and they were against the socialist regime. And the only way to get past this was to separate. And then this translated into the clubs too. Like, after there being only one club, there were two. After there only being one fan network, obviously because there was one club, there were two. And then just as the division in general was difficult and resulted in conflict, this happened in clubs too, and they became kind of a smaller reflection of what was happening in the country. Which then brought me to talking about the iterated prisoner's dilemma. In this sense, we could look at the entire stadium during the game as one complex system with more subsystems within it that then choose to defect from the initial arrangement. To quote Axelrod about this is, quote, "A strategy would take the form of a decision rule which determined the probability of cooperation or defection as a function of the history of the interaction so far. But if there is a known number of interactions between a pair of individuals, to defect always is still evolutionary stable and is still the only strategy with it, which is. The reason is that defection on the last interaction would be optimal for both sides, and consequently so would defection on the next to last interaction, and so on back to the first interaction." End quote. In this case, the benefit was the national identity, and in order to maintain it, the systems had to keep repeating the same strategy they used from the beginning. That is to keep in conflict and to keep divided. The only one that can persist now in this environment. Another thing I focused on was something that the first correspondent mentioned about how one of the reasons he likes being a member of this club is because of the way they address issues. That is, they perceive the rest of the country as living in this delusion that there aren't any problems, that we keep quiet about them, or that we can fix them soon and easily, and the fan networks are kind of a form of resistance to that, and that they at least vent these tensions in the stadium. I then worked on this whole concept of tensions building up into the emergent phenomena and asked the correspondents to try and identify some factors that might have tipped the groups over into just like charging at each other sometimes. And they say that it's different every time, so that they can't really identify one. Like sometimes the triggers that do tip them over work, sometimes not, but usually it just kind of like builds up to there. Like the two teams having a tie score, or the referee doing some ruling that they think is unfair, or the players interacting with each other, or police intervention. Like sometimes these will lead them to football riots, but sometimes they won't. Which then brought me to discussing large events and criticality. If we refer to what Page and Miller said, they said that when they talked about self-organized criticality, they said the key driving force behind self-organized criticality is that micro-level agent behavior tends to cause the system to self-organize and converge to critical points at which small events can have big global impacts. And clearly this was very applicable to my case because these micro-level agent behavior, that is the interaction of the fans, it led to a larger emergent phenomena that is the football riots. And when they say self-organized, that means that there is no central control. And as I said, these fan networks are really decentralized. And they get to this point where, like, small triggers that wouldn't normally tip them over, they lead into riots. It was also really interesting applying the sand pile model to this. When Page talks about this, he said, when the pile has reached this critical state, most of the time, an additional grain will result in either no grains of sand falling off the table or just a few. Occasionally, though, the addition of a single grain will result in a major avalanche, which is what I talked about here, is that sometimes the triggers will work, sometimes they won't. But despite that, the system is still at a critical state where little things will tip them over into something that is unpredictable and hard to stop. And this helped clear up the whole spontaneity of the issue. And also to realize that despite all of that, they're, like, at least in the context of the stadium, they're always at a critical state. Like, no matter what, when they get into the stadium, they're going to be at a critical state, and little things can tip them over, which is why there's this police intervention, which is why they engage in football riots. I concluded in the end that I confirmed what I predicted, that is that this ethnic context here does have a huge impact. It helped clear it up more through all these theories why and how some of the behavior occurs, and then to conclude in the end that the way to fix this, or not even just in this context, but just the way that the youth plays into these ethnic tensions, is just to avoid the extremes. That is not, one of them being not talking about the problems at all, and the other one being aggressive and rebellious and chauvinistic about it, just to kind of address them and prove a point, I guess. And then these two extremes kind of make each other worse because the public keeps quiet about these problems and, I guess, tries to fix them and lives in this delusion that they say, which pisses off these fan networks, and then they, in order to preserve their national identity, to address these problems, they engage in very aggressive, violent conflict to kind of prove a point, which doesn't help the public perception of them, and then this whole, like, negative perception makes them even angrier, and in order to distance them, in order to distance itself from this kind of action, the public then keeps being quiet and harmonious, I guess. I could have used a lot of other approaches to get to these conclusions, but this way I got to focus on both the group at a larger level and an individual level, and then easily include how these interactions in history and then interaction with the other groups also plays into the emergence of riots. So I got to focus on more things at once. The obvious limitation is that even though it kind of helped explain how these things happen or why they sometimes happen and sometimes don't, it only helped me conclude that, yeah, they're really unpredictable, and meaning that if we can't predict them, we can't stop them. And because they're always at a critical point, it's also very hard to ease the whole situation down. Because these problems are so heavily ingrained and because of the whole tradition, it's very hard to stop them. So, and also the other limitation is that despite the fact that, yeah, it's ethnocentric, I only focused on one country, the main bias is that I mostly interviewed people, like the members of the Croatian fan networks, because it was hard getting the correspondents to discuss this with me in general, because of their whole relationship with the public and the media. They don't like talking about what they do. They don't like talking about the way they're organized, because they're so distanced from it. And so because I don't know a lot of people from the Bosnian fan networks, then I couldn't get them to talk to me at all. But in the Croatian fan networks, even though they didn't really want to talk about it, I kind of got to them through like kind of immediate relationships, I guess. But the thing I would do if I did this again was to somehow try and get to the other side, just to make the whole findings more valid, I guess. Another thing I would do is maybe focus on those little triggers a bit more, even though, like, in this whole, because now I focused on the whole theories in the more general sense, and so they were fairly insignificant, but I feel like if I went deeper into them, it would help get close to maybe how we either stop it or understand it better, etc., etc. And that would be it. Thank you very much.